bring it up.
Al, thanks so much.
You're
And
welcome.
all of you who make Kelly House happen, thank you. And thank you for this event. Um, Many of us think about Terrence regularly, and this is a way of kind of bringing that regular thinking together. And Carolyn and Al and Liz and I are all connected by Terrence. We all we well know each other through Terrence, and there are many versions of those family trees out there among Terrence's friends and students. Let me, in my reflection here, let me give you just some context about how I come to engage with Terrence's thinking and with Terrence as friend. We were both in the English department at Colgate. I arrived there in 1980, and very shortly thereafter, my first of thousands of hours of intense conversation with Terrence began, and we were both almost delighted and surprised that we came together in an English department at a liberal arts college in rural New York because we were both trained as literary scholars, and yet we were both immersed in doing research in genocide studies. To put it in a broader context, I'm working on the Armenian genocide, Terrence on the Holocaust. And this just brought our level of conversation to a different place. And we felt there was some great karma, about all this, that somehow we would become buddies and colleagues in upstate New York in 1980 and would be so until Terrence's death 7 years later. And of course, I'm a poet, and Terrence, a formidable critic and scholar of poetry and contemporary American poetry. So that was another layer of our conversation. And, just to say, and more will probably be said about this as the evening goes on, but Terrence was a country kid from southeastern Missouri, and he felt very at home in upstate New York on that pastoral campus. I, on the other hand, was a suburban kid from northern Jersey and metropolitan New York, and frankly, it was, I was always trying to make the adjustment. And Terrence was very helpful in getting me to see, hey, this place can be really cool, Go with the flow, this place can be cool. So let me read to you just a bit of my own reflection here. I began teaching Terrence's book, The Survivor, the year after his death, or it was actually 2 years after his death, but it was the year I began teaching a course on genocide, literature, film, testimony, and trauma. It was kind of the replacement course, although you couldn't replace Terrence's course. It was a mythic, fabled course, immensely popular. Students flocked to it. And Al and Liz and maybe others in this room can tell you about that course from the ground. But I began teaching this course in the wake of Terrence's absence. And I started using The Survivor, and I still use it year in and year out. And I think it's accurate to say that Terrence's book, published in 1975, was the first, I'm going to use the word academic here loosely, because it is a scholarly book, but it's something else and something more. But Terrence's was the first scholarly assessment of survivor experience in English, right? And if I'm wrong about that, I'm interested to talk, with you all about earlier works. But as far as I know, that Terrence broke ground in this way. And of course, there was survivor writing, and there was writing about survivor experience. And Robert J. Lifton, in his 1968 book on the Hibakusha, also begins to theorize survivor consciousness and psychodynamics. But Terrence is the first to do something new. The book became a sensation immediately. It was a front-page New York Times review by Alfred Kazin. Some of us in this book will remember that. And you can't start, at a better place than that. Looking at the book over the years, I've come to see it as a long essay, a Terrence essay. in which his elegant writing cuts across the hard edges of analysis and imagistic probings, as well as making tender edges of emotion and empathy. You know, and I think this has come up here in a number of the talks tonight, but I want to even put it more forcefully. One of Terence's groundbreaking feats in The Survivor is that he brings his chops as a literary critic to survivor testimony and to a morphology and anatomy of his own imagined understanding of the survivor landscape, that is the camp landscape. Somebody mentioned he did create a literary topoi. He has brought a kind of literary intelligence to this experience that breaks ground, and maybe it hasn't quite been surpassed in a certain way. So I want you to keep in mind that Terence is an intellectual student of Northrop Frye, of Richard Chase, of Alfred Kazin, of Lionel Trilling. And that ability to taxonomize, to anatomatize is very much part of the underpinning of much of the compelling dimensions of this protracted essay, in my view, a protracted essay. In a way, each chapter can be read as an autonomous essay about literary responses to extremity, about the brutality of life in the camps. The excremental assault chapter has been mentioned a number of times, and it's an extraordinary piece of writing. About a theoretical speculation of the human species and survival. It was a controversial one. Terence's engagement of E.O. Wilson. And those of you who know the book, you know where it ends. It's a creative and provocative vision. Every year in my course, I teach Terence's book, and I find the book is a moving ethical argument for the moral authority of survivor experience. And students find Terence's work increasingly important. He affirms a deep kind of meaning to survivor experience that in some way was not done, at least in a critical apparatus until this. He was able to affirm a new kind of heroic sense of the survivor of Ravensbrück or Dachau or Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen. He became a conduit and a spokesman for survivors, and the Jewish community fell in love with him. Those of you who are part of that conversation can remember that moment well. And this was interesting for a Catholic boy from rural southern Missouri. And he was overwhelmed, I think, with emotion and gratitude about the reception from the Jewish community, but at a certain point he began to duck a little, to hide, because he was overwhelmed and he was trying to recover his sense of self in order to, and Carolyn talked about this moment, in order to push forward to the next place. But I think he always felt very much a connection to the Jewish community in a very deep way. As Annette just noted, and I want to just mull this over for a second too, he fought in print with Bruno Bettelheim, whose views of survivor experience seemed to Terence and to others as arrogant and self-indulgent and elitist. Terence had staked out his vision of Holocaust camp survivor as someone who had concern for his fellow campmates, who had a moral will to bear witness, who was empathic by instinct and often courageous under pressure, who sought community in the face of annihilation. And Terence's arguments with Bettelheim in various mainstream publications gave even more visibility to the survivor experience. And I want to remind you that this is new. This is the mid-1970s, and if you study that decade a bit in a cultural context, you start seeing that the survivor thing starting to become hot You know, I remember I remember Dustin Hoffman in the film Kramer v. Kramer turns to his son in the film and says, you know, I'm a survivor. You know, that was beginning to appropriate, Hollywood was beginning to appropriate the rhetoric. I'm not suggesting Terrence is the sole reason for this, but he's certainly part of a cultural gestalt that's surrounding the emergence of this complicated concept. I mean, I'm not making simplistic analogies here, but just noting the film itself stuck in my head at the time in the same way. Looking through various lenses at the survivor, others have argued that there's something romantic in Terrence's view of survivor experience, something too heroic in his moral vision of life, in extremity under genocidal conditions. By contrast, Primo Levi, one can see that survivors are crooks, creeps, criminals. And Terrence's book was attacked for its romanticism by Lawrence Langer and others. And I'm always interested in that conversation, and it happens in my course. And I note year in and year out that students find Terrence's vision compelling and hopeful. They read Langer, and they read Terrence, and they come away arguing, and many of them argue for Terrence more so, because they see the survivor landscape as broad enough to accommodate Terrence's humanistic vision, as well as Langer's darker view. And they come away seeing profound truths about human existence. The book keeps circling back to that. And just to close by saying, from a personal perspective, it's fair to say that Terrence's obsession with Holocaust survivor experience came in part out of his own psychological and emotional temperament. His empathy for those who had undergone cruelty and pain, for those who had suffered at the hand of injustice, he was tuned in by his skin and nerves to it. Whatever traumas, and I'm not making any simple psychobiographical claims here, but I'm just noting, you know, in a kind of conditional way, whatever traumas he had endured as a boy, the death of his mother when he was 6, his endurance of a complex family life after that. And he talks about this in the film that Al's going to play you shortly.
Talks about the fire.
The fire in the hospital in which burning flesh is surrounding his own sensory reception. He was tuned in to feeling suffering. The concentration camp survivor of Dachau and Ravensbrück, Terrence's good friend, Helen Sperling, friend of Liz, friend of mine, friend of many of us at Colgate, said this to me recently. Terrence was so upset about the world and its violence, and he was deeply troubled by the silence of the world in light of the Holocaust. I loved how well he portrayed our struggle inside the camps. He gave us credit. I still miss him. I want to read a segment, just a short paragraph from page 59 and 60. Do I have time to do that?
Yeah, if you read fast.
Or I can save it for tonight.
No, go ahead.
Let me finish by saying this, because I've talked to you a little bit about Terrence bringing his chops as a literary talent, as a belletristic essayist, and a skilled literary critic to the study of this reality. And he writes, and inevitably, the mere act of killing is not enough, for if a man dies without surrender, if something within him remains unbroken to the end, then the power which destroyed him has not, after all, crushed everything. Something has escaped its reach, and it is precisely this something, let us call it dignity, that must die if those in power are to reach the orgasmic peak of their potential domination. As power grows, it grows more and more hostile to everything outside itself. Its logic is inherently negative, which is why it ends by destroying itself. So the Foucauldian, as deeply as the Rousseauian, both in Terence. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter Balakian.